Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by BASF.
Hi, I'm Amber Bell, and this is Real Agriculture. We are here today with Mike Palmier with Max Ag Consulting, and we're going to be talking about herbicide timing in pulses. So we're standing out here on a lentil field. So let's talk about herbicide timing, Mike.
So I guess the first thing I wanted to touch base on with herbicide timing is the critical weed-free period for some of the different pulse crops that we have. So say with a lentil crop like this, the critical weed-free period is about 5 node up until 10 node. While on peas, a pea crop is much earlier in staging. So that's basically from emergence till about that 5 node stage. And so you have to keep that in mind to really understand how to optimize yield and your herbicide and your timing with that. Now, obviously, if you don't have a lot of weeds at 5 node and lentils, then there's not much to spray for. So it's a timing between the staging of the crop and the staging of the weeds, and to make sure that we can get proper efficacy and then not leave ourselves too open on the back end for more late flushes of weeds to come through and just, make a mess of your field. So
Right, and what would you say is too many weeds?
Oh, it all depends on what type of weeds they are, right? I mean, we don't want to see very much of any kochia in these fields as best as we can, because we don't have control options in crop, because all kochia is group 2 resistant, and that's generally our products in lentils, unless we're spraying a Sencor or Metribuzin type product, which even then will be a little bit poor on kochia in crop. So I guess to elaborate further on that too, is in order to get that proper weed control in pulse crops, to layer in a residual product either in the spring or in the fall is going to be really important, because to try to clean up your fields in season or with just a pre-burn application without residual is going to be a real challenge. You're going to have some issues. If we have thicker wild oats, those are going to outcompete the crop. If we have lots of kochia, that's an issue this year, but it's also issues in future years because it's going to blow all over the field and your neighbors' fields, and you're not going to be very well liked.
Your neighbor's going to love you.
Yeah, not going to be very well liked in the area. So I guess that's the number one thing I would say with weed control and herbicides is don't rely completely on your in-crop or your pre-burn to save you if you have heavy weed pressure. You have to select the proper field first and foremost.
So exactly when would be the best time to apply herbicides?
So it's really dependent on the staging of the weeds as well as the crop. Now the crop staging on label with a lot of the, say, group 2 IMI chemistries that we have for lentils, we are fairly wide open, 3 node, which is basically upon emergence, all the way up to a 9 node crop. So that's generally wide enough to encompass the majority of our applications. So then it's the timing of the weeds. We don't want wild oats to get much past that 4-leaf, 1 tiller stage where they get to be a challenge to control. We want to keep a lot of our other weeds like lamb's quarters, wild buckwheat quite small because those chemistries tend to be maybe a little bit poorer on them. And to keep in mind that critical weed-free period of, say, a 5 to a 10 node staging. So if we have weeds that are starting to push those tillers, say on the wild oats or volunteer wheat, and it's at 5 node, we probably want to take care of that. If the weeds are still small at 5 node, then let's try to push it back a little bit farther, and maybe we hit it at 7 or 8 node and extend our control a little bit later than that. Now on peas, it's a little bit different again, because that critical weed-free period is from emergence to 5 node. And we do have some options there on kochia with Viper, because the bentazone or bazogran in that type of a product is going to have suppression on kochia, but we want to make sure that kochia is very, very small. I'd say under 1 inch in height, and to be able to time that. And the critical weed-free period is earlier as well. So it's very dependent on weed staging, crop staging, what the conditions are like, to decide what is the best timing every year, because it's going to be different.
Right. That's kind of backwards to the way that I would naturally think, is that, hey, the crop's out there, I'm going to be looking at the stage of the crop, not the stage of the weed. So that's interesting.
That's the first thing that I guess I've noticed when we have learning agronomists with the companies. They always talk about what staging of the crop do we want to spray it at. And I usually, I will turn that
Switch that
around
around.
and say, well, what are the stages of the weeds?
Yeah.
I'm more concerned with the weeds than I am
Than with the
necessarily the crop, as long as it's within that label period.
Right.
If you fall outside of that label period, and you say you're later and you're at a 10 or 11 node lentils, which has happened, what happens in those cases is, you're still potentially able to spray it. You're not on label, so the BASF and other companies aren't necessarily going to support that, and you could run into more issues with crop tolerance.
Okay, so when spraying, how does pre-emergence and post-emergence sprays differ in effectiveness?
With some of the pre-emergent sprays, obviously then we can use glyphosate for some of our applications with a tank mix, of course. And so the glyphosate's a non-selective herbicide where we can get a control on a number of different weeds that we potentially have. There's different products or chemistries or actives that we can mix with that, whether there's saflufenicil or there's some pyroflufen MCPA mixes, those types of things out in the field. And so we do have an option to, say, get ahead of kochia if that's the case, but you have to remember too, the glyphosate's not going to have action on kochia. In west central Saskatchewan, where we're based, we assume that all kochia is glyphosate resistant, and generally it is. So with that, with the contact herbicide, with the pre-emergent, it's very important that we have the water volumes and the proper droplet size in order to control that kochia. And again, if the kochia is really, really thick, you probably need to reconsider whether you actually see the pulse in there or not.
Okay.
And I think that's the biggest mistake that I find in the field, is we tend to force pulses on a field.
Right.
And that's when we have a weedy mess.
Right. So what would you recommend seeding instead of pulse if you have a really heavy kochia field?
It depends too. You've got to be a little bit careful, because in many cases on our pulse fields out here, we will apply a soil residual herbicide in the fall time, and that way we get moisture activation through snowmelt in the spring. And so if you apply a product like a Fierce, which is a mixture of flumioxazin and a peroxysulfone, then there's only, say, wheat, or wheat would be the logical crop to plant in that case, because on the recropping restrictions, canola is a no-go, right? Barley's even, it can be definitely an issue. If you just applied the peroxysulfone, well, then you have maybe a few more options. So you've really got to take a look at the whole system and what you've applied before, and make sure that you don't put yourself in a spot. But if we are going to a wheat and we have heavy kochia, then we have definitely options and multiple options to go in crop and be able to control that. So
okay, so that pre-emergence timing is preferable if you can get away with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we absolutely want to have a good, what I would call pre-seed burn-off. And that's something, I guess, that we focus on as agronomists and as a company, is to try not to push our seeding so far ahead. A lot of guys in our area tend to want to have those pulses in first. We really like to see weeds emerged before, so that we can get a good pre-seed burn off.
Yeah.
And that'll really set us on for a nice, clean, high yielding field later on. So we like to wait for that soil to warm up and see those weeds emerge.
Okay, so what are some common mistakes that growers make in herbicide timing, and how can they be avoided?
Well, I think a lot of the mistake is all based off of one thing, is they're not walking in their fields enough generally. If we're driving by our fields and we have to see the weeds from the road, then that means that they're too big.
Right.
And that's going to be a challenge to be able to control those. So, it's walking in those fields, understanding what your weeds are and what the stages are, because the timing from year to year is going to be wildly different. The 3 years before this year, we were quite dry, so our staging on our herbicide timing was a bit later than typical. Well, this year we've had lots of small flushes of rains, and so what that brings is lots of small, consistent flushes of weeds.
Right.
And so also, the odds are we're going to have a much more competitive crop than what we've had. So we want to start our spray timing a little bit earlier than what we have in the past. So if you just say, well, I always spray 3 weeks or 4 weeks after seeding,
Yeah.
that's not really going to work. We'll see 7-10 days difference in spray timing.
Well, and that can make a big difference
Yeah.
at the end of the year.
Absolutely. So I think spraying weeds too big, we don't want to spray those larger weeds. We're going to have issues with them growing through the herbicides. And when that happens, then we breed resistance too. So it's that, or at times too, let's say we have a lentil field that's on canola stubble and we have lots of flushing canola. In those cases, we almost want to go a little bit earlier to control that kochia, but now we leave ourselves wide open later. So
Right.
it can be a little bit complex depending on what's going on in your field, because your one decision will affect the rest of the year. It's not that these decisions are independent of each
On
other.
their own.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you have any words of encouragement for growers going into this season?
Words of encouragement in West Central Saskatchewan are there in the fact that in many of our area, we have had more rainfall so far this year than we've had all of last year period. And so right now we have excellent crop conditions. We haven't had a lot of stress on these plants, but they are also growing a little bit slower than typical because we haven't had warm temperatures. But I would say right now, I mean, we're in excellent shape for a really good year if this continues. And so we want to make sure to take care of our timings properly. Hopefully we prepped our fields and we don't have heavy kochia populations, because now that's going to be a struggle for the rest of the year.
Right.
And make sure to protect these plants and keep them as healthy as possible throughout the year.
Well, that's great. So that was Mike Palmier on Real Agriculture.